Okay, so I finally finished sewing my first quilt, which I made from shirts and sheet fabric, and I'm gonna do the big reveal now, but I'm also gonna share with you 10 things that I kind of wish that I knew at the beginning of this process. I learned how to quilt completely watching YouTube videos, which I'm also gonna share in the description. But I feel like even when you watch all of those tutorials, there are things that they might mention in passing that for me ended up being like a really big deal in terms of like mistakes being made and things that I could do better next time. So I'm gonna share those with you so that you can kind of just get through your first quilt. And I'm gonna show you what mine looks like right now. Okay, so this is the front of the quilt, and this is the back. The back is just a tiny bit off center with the flowers, but you know, I'm not necessarily too worked up about that because again, I think, you know, it's my first quilt, so I was okay with kind of making a little bit of mistakes, but I'm gonna kind of break down all of that for you right now. Okay, so now that you've kind of seen what the final product looks like, I want to share with you 10 things that I'm taking into my second quilt that ideally you can take into the process of making your first quilt, bearing in mind that this is like outside of just all of the tutorials, which I'm going to link in a playlist, all of the ones that I felt were the most effective and clear and easy to understand, and the techniques that I used for this quilt. So if you followed along the vlog, you know, you will kind of like be able to just do exactly as I've done through this entire process. But I would say the first and most important tip, which I've said through other vlogs, is take your time. Don't make this such a time-bound project, because taking your time is also allowing you to kind of like upskill, to visualize, to do things that you don't realize are really gonna help you throughout the process, because this requires a diverse skill set. So if you're rushing things, you're gonna make mistakes. And to give you an example, I thought this was gonna take me 2 weeks and it took me 2 months. Granted, we had Thanksgiving and, you know, it's the holidays and work picked up, so I had my priorities that I couldn't, you know, work on this every day. But I'm glad I did it, because working on it 2 or 3 nights a week, you know, was a good cadence, because when I wasn't working on it, since I was still interested, I would watch tutorials over again and I would pick things up, or I would look for different techniques, and it ended up, you know, kind of like helping me find techniques, for example, that I didn't even know of before I started this process. So, you know, give yourself time, and with that, give yourself space. This is a 70-inch table, you know, that I'm working on right now, and you could already see this quilt does not lie flat on the table. So this is a 70 by 60 quilt, which was the finished size. And so you need to have space. When you're setting all of these squares down to do the design, you need to set, they're gonna take even more space because they have the seam allowance. And so it took up half my living room, and I had to design very quickly because I have dogs, I have furniture. Like I'm not the type that I could just leave, you know, a mess out when I go to bed. So I had to figure out my design and then pull everything back together in order, and, you know, have them, you know, sort of in like a crafting corner. So if you're thinking about making a quilt and you have just like a little nook that you do your sewing, that's not really gonna cut it. You need to spread out on like a dining table, on your floor in the living room, or if you have a sewing room, then again, like move the furniture around. And if you have a room that you can close and kids and dogs and stuff don't get in, even better. But it kind of brings up another thing, which is sort of give yourself grace to make mistakes. You know, like even just like that example of like laying things out and, you know, doing everything for the first time, you're gonna make mistakes, and this is your first quilt for a reason. You know, you kind of want to learn. So look at this as a learning process, and your goal is completion, not perfection, you know. And don't be hard on yourself, because the mistakes that you make are the things that are going to drill certain elements of the process in your head. So it's actually something that's going to really help you. And again, I would just say, speaking of giving yourself grace, this is another aspect of that. Do not make your first quilt for somebody else as a gift, because you're only going to be 10 times harder on yourself when you make mistakes, and you're not going to have as good a quilt, because your first quilt should kind of be where you're comfortable making all of your mistakes. So, you know, make your quilt for a loved one on your third or fourth time, not on your first quilt. I chose to make this one kind of just something for me to watch TV and cozy up, you know, on the couch, and it's already served its purpose, and it makes me just happy knowing that I achieved that. So I think that's just the perfect way to look at it, because I don't know that I would have finished if I would have put the pressure on myself that somebody else was going to be, you know, on the couch looking at the binding. Because once you say you've sewn something, like, people are going to look for all the mistakes. So, you know, just bear that in mind. And with that, also choose the right fabrics. So in this sense, even though I use shirts, you know, so you have plaids and you have denim, the reason that I have a lot of denim and then I ended up choosing this sheet fabric that went really well with the denim is so that you can't see the contrast as much. And even with the plaid, it hides a lot of the sewing mistakes and the mistakes in terms of like which one is more square, which one's smaller, you know. All of that kind of goes away because you have a bunch of mid-tones, you know, so keep that in mind. If this were a black and white quilt, it would not look as, you know, I mean, I don't know if it looks well done, but, you know, it wouldn't look as, you know, finished, I guess you could see more of the mistakes if there's more contrast in the fabric. That's what I would say about that. Okay, and speaking again, like, I'm really trying to help you avoid a lot of the beginner's mistakes, which you're not going to be able to do, but I would say that these are things that I specifically learned that, again, if I had them more in mind, I would have done better. And one of those is watch the tutorials, you know, from YouTube until you're off book. And what I mean by that is like a Broadway actor where they have to know all of the lyrics to the song. That's what they mean by being off book. And what I mean in this process is watch the tutorials until you can visualize exactly what you're gonna do. That's when you wanna sit down and sew. Don't have the idea that you're just gonna bring your laptop and your phone next to your sewing machine and figure it out there, because not only is it gonna be pressure, but you're also gonna end up making more mistakes. You're still gonna make mistakes, and the perfect example, if you look at the last vlog, you know, I made a mistake in real time because I thought I had it down pat, and I made, you know, one move on joining my binding fabric, and I ruined it until I finally rewatched the tutorial and got it right. But, you know, that's gonna happen anyway, but still, just have as much knowledge of what you're going to be working on and what you need to do before you sit down to do it. That's the best way that I could put that. And with that, I would also say, understand that quilting requires a diverse skill set. It's actually not just sewing, particularly, it's a lot of cutting. And in the beginning, I got a comment after I finished all of my cutting that I wish I had, you know, known before, which is you want to put a weight on your quilting ruler when you're cutting your pieces so that it doesn't shift. Because I did notice that even though in my head I cut everything straight, I noticed later that obviously my ruler shifted at some point because some of my squares came out a little bit more slanted, and when they come out slanted and you sew, you know, directly seam to seam, it's gonna end up being not square. So just keep that in mind. You know, cutting is a really big part of this. Choosing the right fabric is a really big part of this, you know. And then it's different sewing techniques as well. You know, you're not only doing binding, but you're doing borders, you're doing squares, you're doing quilting, the works. You know, so just understand that, you know, if you have one of those skills that isn't that great, or you don't have a cutting mat and you don't have this or that, you may not be able to work on your first quilt. And with that, I would also say, since I did this all watching YouTube tutorials, I think a really good point is that you need to choose beginner-friendly quilting techniques. For example, I love triangular, you know, quilt patterns, but I know that that requires more steps and more skills. So I was like, you know what, let me do 5-inch squares, which, yeah, like, it's a little bit more basic, it's a little bit more, you know, little kid type design, but for me it was, you know, beginner friendly. And so the same thing with the wavy quilting pattern. I didn't even know that this was a thing, the wavy. And then as I was watching tutorials, I was like, oh wow, that's kind of very much my style. I like, you know, organic, like, lines and different things. I didn't want it to be so geometric. And this is one of my favorite parts, is just the way that, you know, the wavy pattern looks. So that just goes to show, choose your tutorials wisely. And same thing with the supplies. I would definitely say that there are some supplies that are better than others. I'm gonna have to do an entire video on that because it's just too much to share for this time. But again, like I said, even just putting a weight on your ruler can make a difference. I'll tell you what I think my sewing machine is capable of. I used a Singer 44, heavy duty 44 series. I think it's a 4423, but I'm aware that I don't think I can do a bigger than 70 inches on that machine just based on, the amount of room I have to put in the quilt. But I learned that from doing it. I didn't see that anywhere that they said, there's a certain size you could do on a certain type of sewing machine. So definitely keep that in mind, but I will do an entire video on that. And the 10th and final thing that I really want to sort of drill down, not only for a beginner, but that I'm 100% taking away, is the fact that you not only need a lot of patience to complete this process, you also need some form of inspiration. So like I mentioned, I'm against sort of making your first quilt as a gift, but that doesn't mean you can't be inspired, by somebody, by something. For example, my quilt design, I realized the color story is giving very much Dumbo, like the, like Disney animated version, like in terms of like, I feel like some of the colors are giving like his mom Jumbo, and then these colors kind of remind me of the other elephants that were like hating on Jumbo and Dumbo and stuff. But again, that was just something in my head, but it inspired me and it gave me this idea. Also, it kind of reminds me when I started looking at the pattern of this Fisher-Price toy chest that I had when I was a kid. It had like a checkerboard on top, and I remember how it smelled. It smelled like cedar inside, and it has like numbers and all of these things. And when I was looking at these squares, they reminded me of being a kid. And so those were elements of my inspiration that really just kind of like made me take it easy when I was working on this. And that's really great advice that I can give. And I'm gonna also do another video on the sustainable aspects of this process, because there are a few tips that I have for specifically quilting with shirt fabric and sustainable materials. So the next video I'm gonna do is gonna be on that. And in terms of the process, what I ended up with after this was a big bag of scraps. So this process also isn't over, because I want to use those scraps to maybe make, a teddy bear in patchwork fabric, and maybe use a lot of the leftover basting for stuffing. So, again, like this sort of sustainable thing is really cool because it spawns like other creative projects, which I really love just based on the waste that I created making this. So again, a few different reasons to kind of keep, checking out these vlogs. So if you haven't subscribed, definitely subscribe. And I would love to, know all of your quilting tips as well. Leave them in the comments, because I've learned from the community that I've sort of started to create on YouTube with the quilting process. And I think that that's something I definitely want to keep going, because, I think it's such a worthwhile process. It's an aspect of, creativity, but it's also, self-care. And there really is something about having a creative project that can keep you warm. Like, I don't know, there's something really powerful about that. I would say it's closer to like cooking than it is drawing, and I think that if somebody else is kind of creative and does all of those things, you kind of know what I mean, where it meets like a basic human need. And I think that that's a very, very powerful aspect of this process. And it's one of the reasons I'm really glad that I decided to make my first quilt.